Okay, so welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Linux. Should you use Linux or should you try Linux? So if you're thinking about making the jump over to Linux from, say, Windows, we're going to tell you about some things that you really need to be aware of before you make the leap or before you try it out. And it's things that you don't see a lot of people talking about. Now, unfortunately, in the Linux versus Windows debate, it's a debate. Unfortunately, you get fanboys on both sides. You get the Linux fanboys saying Windows is terrible and the Windows fanboys saying Linux is terrible, and it becomes a debate and everybody's trying to prove they're right. Personally, I don't care about any of that. I'm not a fanboy. I don't care about Windows versus Linux. I've been an electrical engineer for about 45 years. I've used all kinds of operating systems. In the real world, in the engineering world, you learn very quickly that you use the right software tool for the job. Like if you have a problem to solve, you pick the right tool, and you're not a fanboy, you choose whatever works for that problem you have to solve. So sometimes Windows might be better, sometimes Linux might be better. So I'm not a fanboy, I don't care what people use, but we're going to talk about some of the things you really need to be aware of. Now, you can see here on my desktop, on my computer, this is called the Linux Mint distro or distribution. And this particular Linux Mint distribution is Linux Mint Cinnamon. And I think Cinnamon defines how the user interface here is laid out. I think Cinnamon has a different layout. So Linux Mint Cinnamon. You can start to see there are different versions or distros of Linux that you need to be aware of. So I chose this many years ago based on the fact that it's kind of sort of close to Windows, so I can kind of jump between Windows and Linux, and it's going to be kind of similar. With different versions of Linux, you may not have that. It may be a lot different. So here is my Linux Mint, and you can see it's kind of sort of like Windows. You've got the taskbar down here, and you got icons and so on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with some very simple statistics that you need to be aware of to give you some perspective on Linux. So first of all, Linux is free and open source. And a lot of people see the word free and they say, oh, well, that's got to be good. So I'm going to jump over to Linux because it's free and I don't want to pay for Windows. Therefore, Windows is terrible because they charge you money and I want the free version. You have to be wary of this. Just because it's free doesn't mean it's good, right? With any software. With any tool. A lot of people have the perspective you get what you pay for. If you pay a lot of money, chances are it's going to be more reliable and better. If it's free, you get what you pay for. Maybe, maybe not, but just keep that in mind. Free is nice, but that may not mean that it's what you need. And it's open source, which means that anybody has access to the source code and can modify it and make their own versions. And in fact, at this point, there's over something like 600 distros or distributions or versions of Linux that people have downloaded the source code, made modifications, and made their own version. So you can argue about how many distros are out there, but it's hundreds of versions of Linux out there. Also keep in mind that each of those distros has, updates, different versions. So there's a whole lot of versions and distros out there. Now, you might think that, well, there's a lot of choices, and that's good. Well, maybe, maybe not. We're going to talk about some of the pros and cons of having all of these options out there. The other thing you need to know is about 2% of desktop users use Linux. You can argue about whether it's 2% or 5%, whatever, but it's a very small percentage of desktop users using Linux at this point. If you do the math, you can see there's relatively few users and a lot of different versions. So we're going to see in a bit that that brings up some things that you need to be aware of. So things to consider. With so many Linux distros around, over 600, means that if you're looking for support, say you've got one of those 600 versions and you want support for your specific Linux distro and version can be very difficult, right? Again, there's only about 2% of desktop users are using Linux, and those 2% are spread through, like 600 distros. So what is the likelihood that what you're specifically using of your Linux distro what's the likelihood that there's other users out there with the exact same distribution, using the same software? If you need support, is there going to be anybody out there that has what you need? Keep that in mind. Also, software applications are often available only for specific distributions and versions. With 600 distros out there, keep in mind that if you want some software, you want to download some free software, you got to be careful, because with all those distributions, you may not have a version of that software available for your particular distro and version, right? Now, my experience is that even with a very Windows-like operating system, there's often too much command line stuff. At the end of the day, you end up having to do a lot of things using command line. I don't like command line. I grew up in the 60s and 70s when, we had command line in all the operating systems. I was very glad to get away from that. Command line stuff to me is annoying. If you like that, it's fine. But personally, I don't enjoy command line stuff. Also, installation can be annoying. Let's take a look at one issue that you may encounter, and I encounter it all the time. So let's say I want to install Blender, which is a 3D rendering, wonderful software. I've done videos on using Blender. Let's say I want to install Blender on this machine. So I go to Administration, I go to Software Manager, and here I have Blender. So it's all set. I just need to go click on it and install Blender. So here's the Software Manager, and I can just install Blender. And I just scroll down here and look, Blender, hold on, wait a minute. Version 2.82. Now I produced this video in June of 2022. The version of Blender that they are offering for installation on this Linux Mint Cinnamon is 2.82. At this point, they are up to 3.2 in Blender. What you will see often is what's available in the Software Manager in Linux is very, very old software. This 2.82 is from 2 years ago. And you can see there are comments from people saying, wait a minute, this is so old, this version. So then you've got to go through and figure out, well, how can I download Blender, the latest version? And that's a whole rabbit hole. And you're going to see stuff like this all the time. So just keep that in mind. With Windows, it's, you go to the website, you download it, you're done. So installation can be annoying. The easy install method, which is Software Manager, often installs a very old version. Incompatibility. I use a lot of software. Again, I use engineering software, I use software development software. I use a lot of software. For me, the available software in Linux is quite limited compared to what I need. So for example, here is a list here of some of the software I use that doesn't have a Linux version, or it has a version of that software only for a few different types of distros of Linux. Some of these, they don't have Linux Mint Cinnamon, which is what I use. So you got to be very careful. If you do software development, you may be familiar with Visual Studio. Personally, I can't live without Visual Studio. It's an absolutely wonderful software development, integrated development environment. Of course, it doesn't work in Linux. There is no Linux version. And it has, in Windows, it has Windows Forms associated with that. And I can make an engineering application in Visual Studio with Windows Forms very, very quickly. Just drag and drop, and I've got an application. For example, here's something I use all the time to monitor system frequency. I did recent videos about this. And basically, you just drag and drop buttons. You've got a UI. It's all set to go. You hook it up to your data acquisition device, and it's absolutely wonderful. In Visual Studio, I can make a C# or whatever application, Windows Forms, and you can't do that in Linux. That's it. Visual Studio is not compatible with Linux. So all of the apps I develop use Windows Forms like this. I can't use them in Linux. All right. Now, people will say, well, you can go through and you can get Wine, which is yet another bit of software interface between Linux and Windows. If you want to go down that road, fine. I there's no way I'm going to do that. It's just not worth it. Microsoft Office, it's not compatible with Linux. People will say, well, you can use LibreOffice, which is kind of a clone of Microsoft Office. Maybe you can. My experience with LibreOffice was, for example, I tried to use a PowerPoint presentation in LibreOffice. It didn't have the same fonts, so I had to go through and change all of the fonts. Maybe they fixed that. It's just a big pain, but it may work fine for you. For me, it was a big annoyance that just wasn't worth it. Graphics, Affinity Photo. I use Affinity Photo for graphics editing. There's no Linux version. Engineering, LT Spice, which is an engineering simulation. There's no Linux version. And there's other applications that have no Linux version, or they have, for example, OBS Studio. I use that to record these videos. It only works for a couple of distros of Linux. MATLAB limited to Ubuntu. So you can see there's a bunch of applications, and this isn't a full list, but you'll download an application and say, oh shoot, it doesn't work for Linux. So just be very careful to make sure that if you're going to use Linux, make sure that it supports the software you need to use. Now, security. I also want to mention security. There is this belief that for some reason, Linux is more secure. It's perfectly secure compared to Windows. Now, there is something to that. However, I think it is also a bit of a myth for a couple of reasons. I'm a software developer. If you talk to any software developers, they will admit that generally software developers write code to get stuff done, right? To solve a problem, to do something. Usually they aren't thinking of security. Whether you're writing in Linux, you're writing Windows, you generally don't focus on security. So to say that Linux or Windows is more secure, I think is a bit of a myth. It may be in some cases. I mean, the fact that you've got so few relative users of Linux compared to Windows probably means that the bad guys aren't focusing on Linux as much as they are Windows. Also, open source developers. There's another myth about open source. They think that open source is awesome and wonderful, but again, open source developers generally aren't required to consider security or anything else when they develop software. It's an open source software. People can make their own version. Do you know it's secure? It's really tough to be certain that this open source software is secure when people really don't have any, you don't even know who the open source developer is, and they don't have any requirement to focus on security. So with all of that, I guarantee there will be the Linux fanboys that say, oh, you're just knocking Linux because you're a Windows fanboy. Absolutely not. I'm just providing my experience and some rational issues you need to consider first before you jump into Linux. At the end of the day, keep in mind, let's say you're a software development company and you're writing software. If you know that Windows users are the vast majority of the market and Linux users, desktop users, are only like 2% of the market, are you going to go through and spend all of the resources and hire people to develop software and provide support for it if it's only a tiny percentage of the market? Maybe not. Some people do. Some companies aren't willing to do that. Keep in mind that you can't expect a lot. You've got free software, very small percentage of the market, so don't expect too much when you're getting into the Linux world. Now, that being said, all of the stuff I mentioned may not apply to you. You may need Linux for other reasons, and that's great. It's a wonderful tool for what it is. Personally, I use it a very, very small percentage of the time because my needs get met with Windows. Occasionally I'll jump over to Linux and do some stuff, but it's fairly rare. You may be just the opposite. If so, fine. Use Linux. It's a wonderful tool. It's very popular in Android devices. It's used in very, very many devices. Desktop-wise, not so much. So just keep that in mind. Hope this helps. If you like any of these videos, hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications, and most of all, please let others know that we're here so we get some views. Otherwise, take care. Have a really good day. Thanks.